Hello, Sharif. Hello, Mike.
Hello, Mike. Hello, Caio.
Hi, Sharif. Hi, Caio.
Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having me.
All right, the topic today is about composing modules in iOS apps. So, Sharif, for how long have you been an iOS developer?
I'm an iOS developer for about 4 years until now.
4 years.
More than 4 years till now.
Mostly Swift.
Thanks. More than 4 years.
All right. How can we help you today?
Okay, so as you already mentioned, I have a question related to composing modules when there is a dependency between these two modules.
Mhm.
So the task at hand here today is I have two modules, type event module that loads different types of events, and based on the selected event, okay, we load event listing.
Mhm.
Okay,
So wait,
so
we have here a list of events, right?
That's a type, right? Event type.
Event type.
events type, right?
Okay. And if I select one, for example, sports, I show a list of events with type sports, right?
Yes,
And
it
if I
loads
select entertainment,
event listing based on the event type, right?
okay, so I can change the event type and I get a new list of events. Okay,
Yes.
right.
So what I start with is moving this dependency into composition layer. Okay.
Okay, so we have two different modules here, one for the type and one for the list of events.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's think about this. We have two modules, the event types module, and the other one is the event module.
Yeah, the event
Yes.
listings.
Event listing module.
Okay. And there's a dependency between them.
Yes. The dependency here is the event name and the page number. So the event listing is supporting pagination when you scroll.
So the pagination is for the listings, not for the types.
Yes.
Okay.
For listing.
So the event listing depends on the types?
Event listing depend on the type name, yes.
Type name, but the types don't depend on the listing.
No dependency between not event listing not depend on event types. The reverse is right.
Okay, so when you're requesting an event listing, you need the event type so you can make the request, correct?
Yes, we need to load the event listing based on the event type, and just when the user select specific type. So not loading all events at the beginning. This is the
Yeah.
situation.
Okay.
Okay, so we load lazily. We load lazily
Yes.
as you select the type.
Yes.
Okay,
That's
so we
right.
have a model like an event type model. It has a name, right? Like
Yes.
sports, entertainment, and so on. And you need to know the name of the event type so you can load the listings.
Yes.
Correct? So the dependency here is on the event name, event type name.
Event type name, yes.
Okay, so we have a list, and this list somehow depends on the name. But it doesn't need to depend on the type, right? It could, because the name is a string.
Yes, it's part of the URL that we had the URL of loading event listing based on the name. So we have to send the event name in the URL.
Okay, so the URL is an infrastructure. Yes, it's an infrastructure detail that So this event listing module doesn't actually need to depend on this module
Yeah.
because we can just pass a string, and a string is part of the Swift foundation, right? Standard
Exactly.
library.
Yes, I agree with you. But when we talk about because part of the requirements is implementing also caching for event listing. So caching have to depend on and related to a specific type. So we can just cache event name, have to event type as an object with ID and name.
Okay, so somehow here you will have some kind of abstraction here like cache. Okay, so what you can do, I was saying here, in the event listing, if you need to cache the list of events, you can create actually an abstraction here and not implement the infrastructure here, right? You can have just an abstraction with a method like save list of events.
Yes.
And you can even pass for type, which is just a string, right? The name.
Yes, for now it's a name. It's just a name. We depend on to load the event listing,
Yeah.
the list of events.
So we can have just an abstraction here, just saving the list for a specific type, which is the type name.
Yes.
Right? And if you want to save, do you need to save the types as well? Do you need to cache this? Yeah, you need to, right?
Yes, yes, because it's a relationship between, it's one-to-many relationship
So you
between
can
the
also have
event.
an abstraction here, like, but you only save and you pass here the name, right? For example, or you pass the event type.
Yes.
Something like this. Now, with these two abstractions, they don't need to depend on each other. Because it's just in a string, right? That there'll be an entry point here. There's like create list, make list, and you pass just a type name, which is a string.
Yeah.
So you have some kind of factory as an entry point for this module, where you pass just a string. You don't need to actually depend on any type of the event types module.
But the case here is I also need to cache the event type, the whole object of event type. So event type is not just the name, not just the name as a string. It's also contains ID. So what do you think of caching event type here as an object? For loading, I just need string, as you mentioned. I fully agree with you. But for caching, I need the whole object.
Right. So what you can do here, let's say we have an event type model, right? A struct or a class, and it has an ID and name, correct?
Yes.
And here you have a cache for the event type module, which is an abstraction where you say save event type. So every time you load a list of event types, you cache it, right? Because you don't need to actually load the list of the type to then cache it. Because as you said, you're loading all those types here, all the lists, lazily, right?
Yes.
So as soon as you load the cache, the types, you want to cache it, the types, right? So they are independent. You can save the cache, the types in the cache, independently of saving the list of items. The list of items comes afterwards.
Yes.
So as soon as you load the types, you can already cache them, right? And then you pass a name when the user selects, you pass that name or ID, whatever you need to pass. Maybe you pass here the ID, type ID. But even if you pass the type ID will either be integer or UUID. You'll be something that you don't need to couple the event listing module with the actual model that is in there. If you need a ID, you pass just the ID. If you need a name, you pass just the name. This way, you can decouple these two modules if that's what you're trying to achieve. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But when I implement it, I found that I need the name, okay, from the event type screen. Event name based on the selection, based on the index of the tab that the user selected.
Okay, let's go back to the name then. So we can pass a name, right? Which is a string.
Yes.
All right. So now let's say that we have a cache here, implementation, that as soon as we can make a request to load the list just with the name, correct?
Yes. With the
Okay.
name and with the page number, but keep it with the name right now.
Yeah, but the page
we
number
also-
doesn't come from the event types, so it's something that can be internal as well.
Yes.
Perfect.
It's from it's predefined here. We have only 3 images. We have only 3 pages, but if we aim a more generic solution, it will be from the type the event type by. So the event
But I
contains
recommend
the
you
page.
separating the page from the event type, because then those few features can go, can be tested, and they can be decoupled, right? So the page shouldn't be in the type, because the type here has nothing to do with pages,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
You can have a list of
To have a page count, the whole number of pages, but I got the page name based on the scrolling, based on from the event type feature, from the event type feature. So yeah.
Okay, so you get the number of pages when you make a request to the, when you get, along with the event type, you get the page count.
Yeah.
Because usually you get the page count when you make a request for a list of events, because the paging is related to the list, not to the filters. This is a filter pretty much, right? So the filter doesn't know, because you may make a request here and say, okay, I have all these lists here. I have sports, I have entertainment, and I have music. But when you load sport, let's say they say, oh, there are 20 items in sports. But when I load sports, maybe one item was added afterwards, right? Because this list is dynamic. Someone may have added a new event. So this list is changing in a different direction, in different ways than the types. You can add more things to this list. So you only know the exact number of items for a specific type when you request those items. And part of that request, you will get the pagination, events, handlers, like next page, and how many items are in there. It's part of a separate request.
Yeah, that makes sense, but I think it's a defect in the API implementation by design. But your solution is more elegant and more logic than what I implemented. So I agree with you. We can make the page count and the event listing by, just make more sense. So we have event type name here as a dependency between those 2 modules.
And yeah, but it doesn't need to be a source code dependency that will make you like reference one module from the other. You don't need to import event types to be able to function, right? So it's not a source code dependency. Because I can hard code the type name here and it should work, right? Without even loading types.
This triggers in my mind a question here: how we can consider specific requirement as a dependency or not? How we can decide here? Because I uh, I assume when I try to implement this task and build it, that I have to depend on event type name, and and when we describe here the situation in more details, no, there's no dependency, or it have no dependency between these two modules. So how I can decide as a developer what's the dependency between modules and what's not? This is a
So
side question.
yeah, that's a good one. So source code dependency is, for example, if you pass here the event type, this, you cannot compile this module if you don't import this other module. And then you create a dependency here, right? Because you have a dependency on a type defined in another module. So you need to import that other module. You need to bring the module into your binary. Make sense? And
Yeah.
when you cannot compile code because you don't have another module, you need to import it. That's a source code dependency. You can only compile that if you have that source code available. That's a source code dependency. Make sense?
Okay. So you said that this is not a source code dependency. So
No, this is right here. It is because it's depending on a type defined in another module. So there's a source code dependency on this event type.
You have to type import event types.
Otherwise, it doesn't
while
compile.
you are in the event listings module.
yes, and that's the case. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we agreed.
Yes. But if you just define this entry point as a string, you already have access to the string in the Swift standard library, right?
Yes. That makes
So
sense.
there's no source code dependency between the event listing and the event types modules. Now, you depend on this type name here, but nothing stops you from just passing a hard-code value here, hard-coded value, right? You could just call something like make list and type name sports. So you can run this project without the other one. They are isolated. So there's no source code dependency. In your project, there is an order dependency of events. First, you need to load one, then you need to load the other because you need to first get the list. But there's no source code dependency. And when I say dependency, when in a context of talking about modular design, I'm talking about source code dependency.
Yes. So there are other types of dependency. You mean this is not source code dependency? So I can compile event listing module without need to import event type. Am I understand right? Okay.
Yes. So 99.9% of the time when you hear me saying dependency, I mean source code dependency.
Yeah.
Yes. That's
Referencing
great information.
Another type. Yeah. But if I may here, I think correct me if I'm wrong, you're asking basically, how can you end up knowing that you should ask for a string instead of the event type in your event listings module? Like how do you get the wisdom, like to decide on that, right? Because conceptually you say, oh, okay, I have an event has many listings, so it's one to many, so there's a dependency there. So this happens with experience and becoming aware of what sort of types and what sort of properties of those types you're using, what sort of APIs you're using. So for example, if you're in the event listing, you're importing the event type, and you're using the name or the URL of that event type, you don't need the event type. You just need the data of the event type, right? Which is the string or the URL. So this is your actual dependency there. It's the string or the URL.
Okay. and I think we can eliminate this dependency by making things abstracted and
Yeah, but data already offers an abstraction, right? Like a string is already an abstraction. Because I mean, an abstraction. You get it through the language, right?
Yeah, so there is a benefit of using the event type here. Benefit is that now you have strong type guarantees that you're not going to pass any string. But you have a source code dependency. So there's no one answer that will solve all the problems. If you want to eliminate source code dependency, then you would look for a more abstract solution depending on a more open type like string. But then you need to be aware that people may pass any string here. They could pass here like anything, for example. It would compile just fine. But if you set the event type, you can only pass an event type.
okay.
Right? So you need to make those decisions based on the problem you're trying to solve, because those two things they're acceptable depending on what you're trying to achieve. If you want to prevent from passing wrong type names, then you pass the model, because you can guarantee a compile time that you're actually passing an event type and that you will use that name of the event type. But if you open this to a string, you can pass anything. It could be like completely bogus data. Like right? So it depends what you're trying to achieve as well. So, and then if you start thinking, actually, I want the strong type guarantees there. So maybe they should all be in one module only, like an events module, because like if those features are tightly coupled already, they can only work together. Why not keep them together? Things that change together should be together.
Okay. So should I make these two modules in the same module? So it was a wrong decision that I separate and decouple those modules. You mean that?
It could be if those features are already like they complement each other. They are part of the same feature pretty much. They're not separate features. If you define them as separate features and you want to be able to reuse them in separate applications, then maybe they should be separate. But if you're like, no, they're tightly coupled, those features can only work together. And they will change together because they come from the same backend, then maybe they should be together because they will always change together. They should be developed and composed together. They will simplify development because if they change together and they are in the same module, it's easy to change them, to compose them, right? If you separate them in modules now and you want to keep them decoupled, then you need to make decisions like using strings rather than types, than strong types. But if they are together here, you have no penalty for doing this, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it all depends on the case. So if those features are together, maybe they should be together instead of separate modules. It will simplify as well the caching, right?
Yeah.
You can cache them together. So they're both valid solutions. I think in this case, they could be together.
From complexity perspective here, does make sense to make both modules in the same module to eliminate dependency, but this may lead to more complex while managing these modules.
I think it can be more complex to separate them because now we have two independent modules that need to be composed at some point, right?
Okay.
So what do you mean by complexity in this case?
Complexity, I mean, I need to manage two different things in the same module.
So not a clear separation and things getting out of hand. Is this what you mean?
Yes. And also taking consideration that maybe I need to reuse one of these features in another project?
Yeah, in this
Yeah.
case, you will separate them. You know, if
Exactly.
you need
If
to,
that's the
that's why
case.
it depends on the case. If you need to separate them, and I want to be able to show lists of events without actually loading the event types. Fantastic. Then you
That's it.
separate them.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe I need to show all events, not not just for specific event type.
Hmm. Yeah, in that case, then you can separate them. And one application has this filter, and the other application doesn't. Thus, it makes sense to separate these features, and then when you compose different applications, you only bring exactly the modules you need. But if you put everything in one module, every application, even if it doesn't want the event list type, it still needs to bring it because it's in the same module. Then you need to bring all the source code, even if you don't need it.
That's the point. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why it depends. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. Depend how you're going to reuse this. Depend on the team structure, on the project structure.
Yeah. So we can assume that this is the case here, and based on the solution that I followed in the code, I try to eliminate this dependency, as I assume it's already a dependency.
Hmm.
So how I can put my solution back on the track and make it and correct it to meet this requirement now. So here I have two different modules. I will assume I need to
Hmm.
reuse one of them in another application, and I stuck in decoupling these two modules. Even when I move this dependency into a composition layer.
So one
So
thing, if you want to decouple, if you want to have two modules, right? Let's say the requirement is to have these two modules, and you want them to be decoupled. So you can use them independently in different applications. So you shouldn't depend on any type of the other modules. This should not happen, right? One way of doing it is to use the more primitive types in the entry point of your modules. And inside of this module here, you can even have your own event type definition.
Yes.
Maybe it has only name in this case because you don't need the ID. You have different types because different modules have different requirements. And you define here the modules exactly what you need. So maybe if you want to have an event type here, you can, but it should not be the same defined in the event types module. You need to redefine it with the interface you want. In this case, just the name. And maybe you have a composition, as you said, you have an application at some point that will compose these two modules, right? You can have application one and another application, application two. Let's say application two, it wants only the list and will show all the events without the filters. So it only depends on this module. It doesn't need to know anything about types, but application one will compose both of them. So what the application one needs to do is when it gets a list of types and present on the screen, and then it's time to load the other one, it needs to convert one event type into the other. So in this application here, you will have some kind of adapter that will adapt one module to the other. They will convert event type into the event listing event type. There must be some kind of conversion here. So we have a tiny adapter here in the application target to make sure that these two modules can work together even though they don't know about each other. So
okay,
this
so
adapter will
this adapter will
convert.
be in composition module, right?
Yes.
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 Okay.
Or in a separate module because it cannot be in here or in here. Otherwise, it will couple the modules again. So it either go on its own module or in the application module. Usually it goes in the application module because it's simpler. You don't need to create even another module. And then application 2 just talks directly to this feature here and loads all the types, all the events without filter.
Just one thing here. It's important to understand that the two event type on the purple module and on the orange one, they don't have to mirror each other, right? The event type in the orange module just contains whatever the orange module needs, right? You can even call it event type name, for example, the name of the type, just to demonstrate better here the needs. Does
Have
that
a
make
different
sense?
name, different properties, different everything.
Exactly. They are completely separated. They have, like, it's just, it happens that they have the same name. They had the same name before. This is key to understand here.
Okay. Yeah, I completely agree with you. But when we come to my solution, I already moved this part into another adapter, another in the composition layer. Okay. And I try to implement the same technique here. But I couldn't figure out what is wrong here. What does it make sense to got the event name from the event module? You mentioned here that I need to make another class event type name. So how I can get the name for this class for this type?
So how to get the actual value, right? Now we're talking about
Yes,
the actual instance of that type
yes,
name.
I got it from adapter. Yes, I
It would depend. So where is the UI? Do you keep the UI along in this module here as well? We have the event types list UI, for example, right? And there is some kind of selection, right? I can tap on it, and this should fire some kind of notification or some kind of delegation saying this was selected.
yes,
Right? So through the UI, you will select one item, right? An event type. So you
yeah.
will have some kind of callback.
I already implemented a callback that moves the index of the selected tab. I even go further step and extract the event type name based on this index.
So here in this module, let's say you have the UI somewhere. And when there's a callback from the UI, the adapter will listen to the callback.
Yes.
Whoops. We'll listen to the callback here, the adapter in the application one. And from that event type, it will create the event type name that belongs to the other module. Because it got it here in the callback, right? So the adapter here now has that value, the event type. And then it can create the event type name and pass to this module through the entry point here.
Okay.
And that's how you get the actual value and keep the modules decoupled. The adapter will listen to the callbacks. When there's a callback, you will fire the entry point of the next module.
Okay, so yeah, so the adapter will be the only one who knows both two modules here, and yeah, that's the same technique that I follow here.
And did you have any issues with it?
It works perfectly, but I realize it can be better. It can be more organized, more abstracted than what I already implement. I don't know, but based on the case at hand, I think we have a good implementation.
So you're happy with your implementation then?
Yes, I'm happy with the implementation, but one issue here, I already implemented that the event types loader, okay? But when I try to get the loader for the composition, the first composition, so I have two loaders, one for type and one for events, okay? So I move the event calling by to the scene delegate, the composition layer, in the first entry point. So it first gets types. And this in this composition, this adapter, this composer, I made the API calling of event type. So does this make sense? Does it violates any pattern here? Does it meets the modular design principle here?
Let's see. So you have an event types loader,
Okay,
like some kind of service that will actually load it from a backend, right? And
perfect.
you also have an event list loader. They're coupled, right?
Yes.
So you can load independent.
The
So the entry point
module.
here is like load events, and you pass the type name. Either the type name we created here or just a string, right?
Yes.
Something like this. Whoops. What's going on here?
Yeah. Okay.
Either the string or the type we created here, right? So it's still decoupled.
Okay.
And this event types loader, it doesn't have any requirements to start a request, so it can be just load, right? It doesn't have any input. But this one, you need the type name to actually load a list of events for a specific type. Correct?
Yes.
And what did you say in the application, the composition here? What did you do that you're not sure about?
In composition here, let me make things better. Live composer. In the composition here, I found myself need to call event composer, event composed function, and send it the two loaders, because I need to support caching here, and also need to inject a dependency details, which is the URL of the loader, the concrete loader, with the tab name to be able to send the tab name. This is the event name. I mean.
Mhm.
So I don't make sure this is best practice here, because URL here is considered implementation details, and I can't abstract it to because I needed to send the event name.
We have some kind of composer inside your module, correct?
Yes.
And the entry point is like make my list view controller, and maybe this returns a UI view controller, right? With the composition. Is something like this?
We can assume it. Yeah, can assume
Yeah, okay.
it's like that.
And you say that you need to pass a type name and then two loaders? The event list loader and a cache?
Yes, the cache, the bus load is for remote and cache.
This cache, something like this.
Okay.
And you mentioned that the URL is a detail, and are you also passing a URL?
Yeah, I need the URL here.
Or you create the URL inside the composer?
I need to create the URL and add components to the URL, like query parameters to add the event name and page number, if I will support pagination, and this is the case here. So all of these details I need to inject in the composer of another module. So you got my point?
Yes. So the question is if it's okay to pass a URL or all the details it needs to create a URL into the composer that is inside the feature module.
Yes.
Right. Ideally, the URL creation should be around in the application as well. At least the base URL should be defined in here. Because then when you start in the application, or different applications can have different URLs, talking to different CDNs, different backends. You could also be deciding if it's an application with a debug configuration, a development, staging, production URL. So this will all be decided at the application layer, like the actual environment. Environment details like URL, base URLs are defined, API keys are defined in the application module. Because these modules here ideally should be able to work with any configuration, but it shouldn't decide which configuration it's running, right? So usually it's best practice to have environment details in the application layer, in the application module.
You mean by application layer, the composition layer?
Yeah, the actual application module, where you have frameworks. For example, you have your frameworks here. Those frameworks are not applications. They are reusable code across applications. And eventually you will have an application module, right? Which contains the composition for that specific application. And the URLs, the environment details, the API keys, they are defined in the application. And you inject those details into your modules. Thus, you can reuse those modules with different configurations for each application.
Okay, so I have just to recap for what you already said. I have this URL, this base URL in the application layer. Let's say it's in scene delegate, okay, or any constant class that contains the base URL. So in the composition, I still need the query parameters and the constant URL in the composer of this feature, the another feature, which is listing.
So let's imagine we are passing here a base URL, which will contain the environment details, right? The question is, let's say we have this function there, make list, and here you pass the type name, URL, no, string, and then you pass the base URL. Now, inside of this method here, you need to create the actual URL that you make the call, right? There'll be like base URL dot appending the path component, and maybe it's like and filter equals type name. So you need to know this path component here, for example, adding this filter here is leaking implementation details of an API, right? Each API may have different query parameters. One may call it filter, one may be a path, filter / type name. So this is infrastructure detail, right? Communication with the backend. And you're asking how to hide this from the module?
From a different module that doesn't care with these details, even because this is not a dependency for this module, because it can compile without the need of this filtering stuff.
Yes. Otherwise, if you change the backend, you need to change the module here.
The module, yeah.
So if you want to decouple your module from the backend specific details, you can either pass already the final URL. You even pass the type name. You will construct the URL. Here, the adapter knows the event type. So the adapter has enough information to create the URL for you. And it's already in the application module. They have access to the environment details, right? So you can create the URL, and here you just pass the URL, the fully loaded URL. This is one option. And you're still not coupling these two modules. And you're now you can pass any URL here. As long as it returns what you're expecting, that should be fine, right?
Okay, so I have to construct this URL in application module, let's say in scene delegate. Okay.
If you want to
So
hide it from your module, yes.
Okay.
If you want to
So
hide API details from your module, yes.
okay, that's that makes sense. But here I'm still need the event name. So I first download and load the event types, okay? And based on the selection is I got it from a listing event,
Yes.
a
Here.
new feature, a different module, okay? So to construct this URL in the application layer, I need this event type name.
Yeah, you got it
And
here. The adapter is listening to the callback of the event type selection, right? Every time there's a selection, the event types list UI, which is this one here, right? Every time there's a selection here, there'll be a callback. The adapter is listening to that callback.
And based on this, the callback, it will start constructing this URL with this.
Yeah, because here you have all the details. You have the event type, and the event type has an ID, has a name, has all the properties of the event type. All the information you should need to create the URL.
That makes
And
sense.
then, because the URL is already an abstraction provided by the foundation framework, right? So you can pass here the URL to this module. This is one solution. Now, the other solution is this event list loader can be just an abstraction as well, right? Just like the cache. So here, you don't need to pass a URL because, look at this. You have the loader and cache as requirements that someone else needs to implement. That's what a protocol is. It's a bag of functions that someone else needs to implement, right? Now, you can have another module, like you can have an infrastructure module with the implementation of all the requirements. So we will implement the cache.
Like a core
Now,
data.
it doesn't need to be one infrastructure module. You can have more than one. You can have one for the network, one for the cache, and so on. But now, the implementation is here. So all the details about URL will go in the implementation. So maybe you have a remote event list, oh, not cache. Let's use the list loader. List loader. I will implement the loader. And this one requires a URL. Right? It requires like as a dependency. Here. Type will conform to the protocol. But it's outside the module. It's infrastructure details. It doesn't need to be in the main module. Because maybe application 2 doesn't want to use the same remote list. It can use a different one. So you can separate the infrastructure implementation details. That's another solution. You separate the infrastructure details from the core module, the feature module. So can you find this as more as the domain, like the core models and services that this application needs to function decoupled from infrastructure details. The actual implementations can go into a different module, and you can have multiple implementations of that infrastructure for different applications. Let's say application 1 wants this infrastructure for this remote list 1 that requires a URL, but maybe application 2 will provide a hard-coded one with a list of predefined events that you can select. You have this it's more flexible.
Okay, this makes sense. Okay, so here the infrastructure module will be implemented by the feature module, which is event listing, right?
It's going to implement
event listing loader.
Yeah, so those are just protocols or any kind of abstraction here that will be implemented by another module. So the infrastructure here can be a module that implements the dependencies that the feature needs. If you want to hide the infrastructure details from your modules, if you want to allow different infrastructure implementations. For example, this is usually more important for the caching side, because you can provide a core data implementation or a file system implementation or an in-memory implementation of a cache. And those are infrastructure details that can be defined in other modules. So application 2 can have just an in-memory cache, but application 1 can have a core data implementation of the cache that will persist across application runs.
Okay, so I also need infrastructure module for event API.
Event type.
Event type, sorry.
Yeah, if you want to keep the details decoupled. And the good thing now is that you can use the same, let's say you have a cache here, like a core data repository that implements
So
both.
just for caching event listing, right?
You can either say this one can only cache event list and say this is only going to implement this protocol, but since they share like the types and maybe you want to compose them in the same database schema, it can implement both. It can also implement this cache here. And because they share the same name, event type has a name, and you have a name here, you can compose them in the schema. When you save them to the file system there or in core data, you can save this event list for their event type with that name. So you can have one schema shared in the infrastructure for the caching, even though those two features are decoupled, because that's an infrastructure detail. Or you can say, I only want to cache types, but not lists. That's fine as well. You can do it. Or you say application 1 wants to use an in-memory cache. No problem. We can create another infrastructure for in-memory cache. We'll implement it. It can either be inside the application module, or it can be in a separate module as well.
Okay.
So it's the same feature with different infrastructure for different applications. Or you can even say, if you are a paying customer, you are a premium customer, we give you core data caching or like this persistent caching. But if you're not a paying customer, you have only in-memory caching. So if you close the app, you lose everything. You need internet connection to use it. But if you are a paying customer, you have this feature where you get the offline caching. Right? So it opens up possibilities.
Okay. This makes sense.
But this is driven by requirements. If you have this requirement of separating the infrastructure, that's fine. Otherwise, you can say, no, this event listing is specific for this backend. So I don't mind having my API implementation inside this event listing. But then you need to know that if you want to use the same module with a different backend, we have more work because then we have to find a way to decouple it.
Yeah, that's right.
It's all driven by the requirements. There is no perfect solution that will work all the time, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I completely satisfied with this solution, even if it seems more complex than what I already implemented, but it really solves the problem of moving lake details into separate module. I don't know if we have time to talk about implementing caching while taking pagination consideration.
Pagination with caching. Same, like, can you do pagination without caching?
Yeah, excuse me.
Do you have a problem with pagination without caching?
No, not a problem. But I got stuck in implementing this equation. So for example, let me describe the situation in a specific way. For example, when I scroll and hit Bolt to refresh, okay, and I'm in the page 3, for example. So the API will call the events, and based on the selection will call the event listing. Event type will call the event type at first. Then based on the selection will call the event listing. And I will be return back to the page 1.
Yes. If you load 3 pages and then you load back here, you load page 1 again. But since the traditional, the basic pagination based on pages, they don't guarantee that the first page is going to be the same. So usually what you have to do is when you load the page 0 again, you need to delete everything and restart loading the pages from 0. So it depends on the pagination that the backend implements. If it's a pagination, more smart pagination with key set pagination, for example, where you pass a key and say, show me all the elements after this key or after this e tag, it's based on a timestamp, then you can start caching it more efficiently. But if it's just based on page 1, page 2, page 3, you may have issues because items could be removed or added from a page. So every time you need to clear the cache when you load page 0. It's not reliable. It's not a reliable pagination.
What's the case if I'm already offline and the user scroll and hit Bolt refresh? So what should I load here?
If you're offline, it will show nothing, right?
Yeah. Don't have that
Or
problem.
whatever you have in the cache. But in this case, since you are offline, you should show what is in the cache, but usually you show a message saying last updated 3 days ago. So they know that this data is not fully up to date. So it's an optimistic caching because if you don't have reliable paging, you never know if you're showing the right, the full data set.
So the best practice here is to show nothing or show the latest page based on the data I have, because I cached the event listing based on the page also. So the page is already involved in the caching. So
right. So every time you refresh here, you should load the data from the backend because the user is manually saying, I want the most up-to-date data that you have, right?
Yeah.
So every time they refresh here, you need to load the page 0 again to get the latest up-to-date version. Now, if you try to load here and it fails, you can still show cache data, but you need to show an error somehow saying, hey, this request failed. But I'm showing you old data. So they know that you are looking at old data, right? That's the best practice, is being transparent of this is not up to date. I'm not sure if it's up to date because the connection failed.
Yeah. But what about if the requirement is, hey, show something to the user when he already offline, and as you said, the request failed. So should I show the same page with the same events, even if the user is located in another page or not in the zero in the first page of the events? Or should I clear the cache and show message to the user that
No, you have the cache. In case you don't have connection, you can show it, right? That's one of the benefits of having a cache. So if you try to load and it fails, then you should show whatever you have, but it still show an error so they know that, hey, this is the data I have to show you right now, but it doesn't mean it's the most up-to-date one, right? So being transparent about this. And this specific rule will depend on the application you are building. This will come from the requirements, because maybe you are working with some sensitive data that after 3 days you should not show something that is more than 3 days old. Then you have a rule in your cache to never show data that is more than 3 days old. Or you're working on like showing the current forex, for some currencies. Then you need to show the most up to date, like the oldest data you can show is like 3 seconds ago, for example. So it will depend on the requirements as well. There's no best practices to be transparent to the user, and so they know that this request failed, but I'm seeing cache data, so I know that I'm not looking at the most up-to-date data.
Or in the case of the events, maybe don't show something that is in the past. Maybe it doesn't make any sense, to show, like a play or a sporting event that's last week, something like that. So
Yeah.
it all depends on what the requirements are there.
Yeah. Even if the requirements is implementing caching, when you are offline and you supporting pagination here, it doesn't make sense to show a reliable cache, because the page here will corrupt your order, because you have a mechanism to order the events also, and you have to make sure that this is right page with the right data with the right order. Yeah,
it depends how reliable the data must be in your specific application. Because if you load like the first page and you get 10 items, so page 1, and then you load page 2 and you load another 10 items, now you have 20 items, right? And then you load page 3, 5 items, now you have 25 items in the cache, correct? You are appending to the cache, so you have 25 items in the cache. Now if you try to load page 1 again, put to refresh, and it fails, I think you should show these 25 items in there if the data doesn't need the level of reliability of being the most up to date. You show the 25 ones that you have in the cache and an error message. You show the error message, but you keep the 25 items in the screen. Make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
And if you close the app and open again, you should show these 25 items in the cache until you load to the next one. But you somehow tell the user that, hey, this data is not up to date. One way is to save the last updated date and showing a message. Last updated 25 minutes ago, something like this, or 3 days ago.
Yeah, so I also need the timestamp to save the order of.
Yeah, you can store this in core data, for example, right? In your schema, in core data here, you don't need to leak this detail anywhere else. And it can be just a date as well. When you return here cache, you should return something like cached items, and part of these cached items you have a property like updated at, which is just date.
Yeah.
And you store this date in core data, in the file system, whatever mechanism you're using, Realm. And every time you get a list of cached items, it will come with the items. So it will be here. List of event. And the updated date as well. And then it's up to you to show this in the UI if you want to or not. But you define in your module your requirements. I want to know when it was last updated. So you need to define here in the requirements, and whoever implemented those requirements needs to provide the data. Statically, you cannot even compile if they don't provide you the data. So you always have the date. So you define in your feature the requirements for that feature, and then when the infrastructure implements it, it needs to provide all the data you require.
Okay. Does make sense.
These requirements will be based on the reliability of the data, how old they can be. This is all application specific. You need to discuss this with the business analysts, the designers, and figure out how to deal with it in your application. Make sense?
Yeah, this makes sense.
To clarify some of your questions about composition.
Yeah, I already satisfied with the solution. We end up with it.
Awesome. Now practice.
That's it.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. This is a golden rule.
Yes. All right. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sharif.
Thanks, Caio. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks for your helpful. Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye. Take care.
Hello, everyone. Anyone in the chat? Yeah. In this particular case, I see we can have event types logic in event listing module itself. Yeah, as we showed there, you can keep them in the same module or in separate modules depending on what you're trying to achieve. In this case, he needed the separation because he wanted to use the features in different applications independently. Is it normal the composition root is very large? It can become very large, but you can break it down into more modules or separate components. It doesn't need to be large. It can get large, but it doesn't have to. When I reach zero dependencies relations, I'm starting to worry about the fact that the integration of components is very complex and difficult to test. Yes. That's why you need to find a good balance between the dependencies. You want low coupling, high cohesion. If you keep adjusting your design, focusing on low coupling, high cohesion, you should reduce the risk of getting into this case of having very complex composition that is hard to test, absolutely. High cohesion means keeping things together that should be together and separating what should not be together. Not everything needs to be decoupled. This is a decision, a case-by-case decision based on the requirements of your application.
Yes. And again, start simple. Bye, y'all.